Welcome back, and for those who are new to the New Levels Coaching Podcast, a very warm welcome. It's a little bit cooler actually, it's the end of January, we've had mixed weather to say the least, and we're into episode 19 already of the New Levels Coaching Podcast. Remember, we are the endurance podcast that brings you lots of inspiration and education so you can literally go away and run with that. And this week I'm delighted to be joined again by Dr. Matt Long, my good friend and fellow coach here in Loughborough. Matt is also one of our coaches at New Levels Coaching, and if you haven't heard Matt's first two episodes on the New Levels Coaching Podcast, then I suggest you go back and you check those out because they are a brilliant insight into lots of different areas which really tie into today. So this is almost part 3 of Matt and Lewis being together on the pod, and I'm really looking forward to it. This episode is all about training zones, training intensities, and how you get that right. Whether you are a runner, whether you're a triathlete, whether you're somebody who's looking to get into running for the very first time, it's something a lot of people struggle with. What does pace mean? What does effort mean? Well, we're going to go right back to basics, strip it back, and I'm going to pick Matt's excellent coaching brains about how he does that with his athletes, how he does it himself as a runner as well, and how we can then apply that to our training. So this is episode 19. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back, Matt.
Thanks for having us back. Can't believe it's the 19th episode. It shows how popular this series is. Do you see this running forever to kind of pardon the pun?
Yeah, it is a pun, isn't it? Because do I see myself running forever? I hope so. I hope I carry on right up into my great master's years. And do I see the podcast running forever? Well, I think at the weekend I was given a bit of surprise. I went to the Midlands cross country and somebody stopped me and said, "Oh, I've just been listening to your podcast this morning," and I'd never met that person. And I said to Gemma, that was the first time that's happened. Somebody random has stopped and said, "Really like the podcast, really enjoy it." And I feel like as long as we're providing that value to the running community, we should keep producing the podcast.
Sure, and well done about your own excellent performance there. I think you were 26th in the Midland counties at the weekend, and hopefully that could lead, fingers crossed, to a county vest in the forthcoming Inter-Counties Championships, which is great.
Yeah, my first ever Leicestershire county vest. I was a northeasterner back when I was younger, but obviously now a resident here in Leicestershire as I base myself in Loughborough. So I've been invited, or certainly will be considered, for the Leicestershire team, and apparently Leicestershire won the Inter-Counties last year, Matt.
I believe they did, yeah. And it's certainly
men's.
A real achievement as a Masters athlete. Sorry to remind you of your age, but you are above the age of 35, unless I'm mistaken. So a real achievement. We've often spoken, haven't we, about you. You're very, very keen to emphasise this idea of bridging. We spoke about your own career as a former British champion and World Championship representative for Team GB, of going from club to county to regional level, running for the North, running for England, then GB. And it's almost as if, you're coming down the stairs, but you're still taking those steps, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think that was a really good way of looking at it. I got quite excited to be asked about that. And I remember the first time I got excited to run for the county, but it's just where I am with my running now. And what I really liked about the weekend, I was doing something for myself, which I know you're big on. You've got to have your own time. And I used to get a little bit worried because I thought I should be coaching. I'm a coach, I should be coaching. But actually, there's some times when you need to put something in your calendar for just yourself and your own mental health. And I've really enjoyed that. And hopefully I've got my eyes, back, or certainly open the eyes of these England Masters selectors like yourself to potentially get in sneaking one of those teams, but that's a long way off.
And again, you might find that second time round, it's almost as if you're going back to your roots, almost where you started, maybe looking 20 odd years ago, getting your county vest, but you probably will enjoy it from a process point of view a little bit more this time, because you're not striving to get up the ladder, you're accepting where you are, which is what I took from the podcast number 18, the excellent podcast that you did with Alex Haynes about being in the moment. Lots there about being mindful, not pushing too hard. Alex himself talking about the difference between running 90 miles a week, 100 miles a week, wanting to represent Team Wales, and now being happy with a relatively young family running 30 miles a week.
It's all about where you are in your life, isn't it? And what you're looking to achieve. And we had a really good coaching discussion just this week around, actually it was at the marathon workshop, where should you start with your running when you've planned out these long-term plans? And we were saying to the athletes, well, you've got to know where you're going with your goal, but you've also got to know what you want. It's a really important factor. And it was a very good episode. I really enjoyed it with Alex. I love getting back together with Alex. He's my old coach, and we do just bounce off each other as we do, Matt. But you were racing at the weekend as well, a fell race, I believe, and a little bit lost on the route.
Well, the good news was it was probably quite a serious fell race. It was called Tigger Tour up in Sheffield, on the outskirts of Sheffield, and I managed to pass the kit test where they check whether you've got the gloves, the hat, the thermals, the compass, the whistle. But of course, what I didn't tell them was I've never used a compass since I was 15 years old at school. And of course, I did get lost after about 7 miles. I was, towards the rear end of the field, about, halfway, 2/3 of the way down the field, and suddenly took a drink, looked up, everyone's gone. Do I take this path, that path? And of course, I ran along with a runner then that was just behind me, got chatting to him after about half a mile, realised he was just on a training run. He had no number on.
So he was just out for a normal run.
So he was out for a run. So I thought that he was taking me around the course, and he said, "No, I'm not in any race."
Oh no, we've all been
all's
there.
Well that ends well. I got caught up by some people who were further back behind me, and we ran round together. So I made it in the end.
Excellent. And in the spirit of today, we're talking about training effort and zones. What sort of effort for you at the weekend was it, Matt? How hard were you trying?
I would probably say about a 7 out of 10.
Okay.
It was quite a big volume race for me. It was a 9-miler, which of course doesn't seem like an awful long way, but it's a heck of a long way. When you're climbing nearly 2,000 feet, which is more than 400 meters, and whatever, yeah.
It's good elevation. I'm well into my elevation now, as you know, with the trail and ultra stuff, and it's a big part of my planning. Actually, it's something I've had to learn quite quickly. How do you get that elevation change in your training?
Well, you've got the workshops coming up, I think
we have, and hopefully you'll be joining us in the Peak District, fingers crossed, for the trail camp, which will be cool. And we've got the physiology workshops coming up in Birmingham, which you're familiar with over at the track there. We've just had the marathon workshop, so lots to obviously come in the year. One thing we were chatting about at the weekend was this, effort level of scale. The common question we get from a lot of runners is, how fast do you want me to run? And I think it's fair to say that most people sometimes run too fast, or certainly on easier days or recovery days really struggle to lock into that easier pace, that recovery pace. And we just simplified things, and it was kind of a light bulb moment for me where we talk a lot about RPE and effort out of 10, but some people still don't get that understanding of it, and it's really important to go quite deep with it. And I think that's what I want to do today, is look at those scales, and particularly those training zones that people refer to, and maybe unpick some of the myths around it as well, around junk miles and things like that, and all this zone 2 training and 80-20 rules and all this sort of stuff. And I'm intrigued to see, what your thoughts are on. We've mentioned it before, the RPE scales. Do you still use it in your coaching, Matt?
Yeah, remember we spoke, I think last time we were here, Lewis, we spoke about that kind of binary between running to split on the one hand and running to feel on the other. And I think the good thing about both any zonal system and any RPE system is it offers you that halfway house, because it's about perception. It clearly is about feel. But inevitably, if you talk about zones 1, 2, 3, 4, and if you talk about an RPE scale, it's 1 to 10 or 1 to 20, whatever kind of Borg scale you use, that quantification, that numerical figure does give you some kind of benchmark. So I think that the zonal system that you want to talk about and the RPE system offer a kind of middle way. They take the best of feel and the best of split. So I'd like to pick up where we left that debate before, and rather than seeing it as a binary in either or, let's go for the middle ground.
Yeah, I like that, because you're saying, look, we've got all this data out there now, and you can look on these watches. They're incredible now, some of these watches, what they can give you. But I still believe this perception of effort is so important. And actually, to go back to the weekend, I kind of had an idea of what sort of shape I'm in. But in cross country, it almost becomes irrelevant, your pace.
Of course it does.
And I didn't even have my pace on, my watch. I was all to effort. And I was questioning myself, could I do this for another 35 minutes? Have I got another 35 minutes of this level in me?
Yes.
And constantly checking in with myself. But I would look for certain points, as you say, for just a little bit of middle ground where I'd check my watch, and I wasn't looking for pace, but I'd say, okay, how long have I done? I've done 10 minutes. Good. Right. I know I've got another 30 left now. So I wanted some data to help me with that perception of effort. But ultimately, I was listening to my body and listening to my breathing and all those things.
You mentioned your breathing, but what other specific things, those kind of, I guess we call it kinesthetic feedback, bodily feedback, what were you listening to internally then, apart from your breathing?
Good question. So I actually, I'll be honest, I was also listening to other people's breathing, because I was thinking, right, are they trying a little bit too hard? They seem to be breathing a lot heavier than me. So I was taking a bit of confidence from that. I was feeling my legs. So are my legs feeling okay? And at the start of the race, they're feeling quite fresh. They were feeling great. But I was also climbing the hill. I was like, okay, how do my legs feel on the hill? How am I reacting to that? On the downhill, am I feeling anything quite different? I was getting a feel for the ground. Where do I feel like I'm putting in less effort but getting more return? So what parts of the course are better for me? I was trying to suss that out as we went as well. And then I was listening to things as well, like my feet started to hurt later on in the race, started to get a bit of blisters because I'd not worn my spikes. So I was asking myself, how are this feeling, and then trying to block that out almost. So there was certain kind of perceptions that I wanted to feel from, but ultimately I kept going back to myself and saying, where am I on that scale? Where am I on that Borg scale, that RPE scale? Because in my head, I wanted to set off around 6 or 7, which I class steady towards kind of tempo. And by the end, on a sliding scale, I wanted, and I think this is an important point, I wanted that intensity not to change, but I knew that RPE would then go up with the duration of the race.
Of course it would, yeah. And how often were you looking and cognizant of what was going on your watch? Because I know that the splits are immaterial on a cross-country course, but, you would have known that it was a distance of, I don't know, roughly 10K, maybe 12K. You would be looking at the time and the distance on your watch. How often, how frequently did you look at your watch?
If I can remember rightly, I looked at it 3 times.
3 times.
I looked at it around about 10 minutes just to get a feel, see if my perception was right. Have I done around 10 minutes? And that was kind of my thinking. I think it was just over. I looked again at around, I think I caught it just below 30 minutes. And then again, I looked, they sent us on the final bit. I thought we had a little bit longer to do. And they said, no, you're going down here. And at that point, I checked just to kind of get a gauge for how long I was away from the finish. I was trying to judge my effort there. And I think I was about maybe a kilometre away at that point. So I knew, okay, right, I've got a kilometre left now. Now I've got to gauge my effort for that last kilometre.
What's very interesting about what you've told me, almost from a psychological perspective, is, again, it's not a binary. You've clearly focused on process-based things. You've clearly listened to your internal kind of feedback, your bodily feedback. But you've also been goal aware in terms of the time, in terms of the split, in terms of the distance. And you remember us talking, I think, informally about a particular psychological theory which was invented, I think, in the mid-1970s by Apter and Smith. It's called reversal theory. And the basic principle behind reversal theory is that we can never spend too much time in one psychological state only. Yeah?
Got you.
We need to be reversed by external cues or to reverse ourselves. In your case, between what we call the telic, being goal-focused, looking at your watch 3 times, looking at the distance, looking at how far you've got to go and praying for the finish line. But also you've got to reverse back to what they call the paratelic, the process, the feeling. So Apter and Smith, if they were around today and still writing about reversal theory today, would be very interested in the interplay between those two binaries, the fact that you needed to do both at various points. And it's getting that balance right. And isn't that what there's an emerging theme of this podcast already. It's not about binaries. It's about knowing when to run to feel, knowing when to run to split, knowing when to focus on goals, knowing when to focus on process. It seems to me as an elite athlete, which you were, and still are in many ways, and will be as a masters, that you've got that balance almost intuitively right.
And I say to people, I always have, that I felt like that's always been one of my strengths as an athlete. And then they'll say, well, oh, you're just quite lucky that you've got that as a strength. And I go back to them and say, actually, no, it's because I've spent years practicing it. And I don't look at my watch much in training. So to give an example, I was running a session this morning with Gemma and Chris, and apart from looking to see when we needed to stop the rep, I don't look at it at all.
Of course.
I just judge it all on effort. But then I might look at it every now and again. So, for example, on the last rep, I said to Chris, we're halfway there on the last rep. We've got 3 minutes left. So again, just that little bit of like goal focus, right? 3 minutes to go. Let's put it back in there. But then I look back into, okay, how much effort I've got to be putting in here. So the reason I'm good at it in races is because I've spent so long doing it in training, which we're trying to encourage people to do more.
So what I'm hearing is it's about habituation again.
Absolutely is.
Get it right in training, and then carry that into the particular race,
Well, I don't know about you, Matt, but I just don't see how people can do it in the race and expect to do it if they're not doing it out of habit in training. Like for me, that is what training is. It's about learning all those things, not just physically, but also mentally, so that when you come to the race, it's more familiar to you. So it's not I'm just doing this out of chance. It's actually not luck at all. It's something you've constantly practiced.
It is, isn't it? And I think we've both spoken, haven't we, about how athletes that we work with struggle with the notion of a float. Remember, we speak about a float recovery, and I think we've both spoken at times about our frustrations that some athletes will want to, again, quantify that it's not good enough to say, well, a float is slightly faster than a jog. It feels biomechanically like an easy run rather than a shuffle. People will want you to set a particular split for that 400-meter float for the minute that you ask them to cover. And that really is revealing, isn't it, about the cultural issue that we face with running today. Even the recovery, if it's an active mode of recovery, has to be quantified.
Yeah, I actually posed this question to a mentor of mine who I've been working with, who's been helping me with, we've always done that in our world on the track and on the road, but in the trails it's very different. We have a lot of splits on the track. You and I call them out on a night on a Tuesday. They come through, it gives them that feedback as a training, and you don't have that information when you're on the trails. But one of my questions was around that float recovery. Sometimes I want that float recovery to be an easy float recovery. So like an easy jog, an active recovery. But sometimes I want that float recovery, just depending on what I'm looking for from the session, I want it to be more of a steady float recovery.
Of course.
So it's a little bit faster. And I said, look, do you quantify this any different to how I do? And he said, well, how do you do it? And I said, well, I actually just use RPE. I go to the athlete and I say, right, I want you to do a float recovery. And if it's an easy float recovery, I want you to be between 2 and 4 out of 10 for that recovery. That's what it should feel like, 2 and 4 out of 10. But if it's a steady, I want you more like 5 or 6 out of 10. And then I want the reps at this sort of intensity. And he said, yeah, that's exactly the same as what I do. And he's one of the best trail coaches in the world. And he said he used it for any standard of athlete.
And I think you're right, Lewis. I think, again, speaking more with my sociology hat on as well, I think that the idea of a 1 to 10 ranking is interesting in our culture. I thought about this podcast the other night. I was watching, I think it was a rerun of Strictly Come Dancing. And, everybody, contestants are marked out of 10, aren't they, basically? And then you open the tabloids and you'll read about, Marcus Rashford's performance for Man United, and he's rated out of 10 and the referee's rated. So it's something that the RPE scale, the out of 10 scale, as you've alluded to, is something that we've all got a kind of wider cultural reference point for, really. So it is usable. It is user-friendly, isn't it?
It's user-friendly, and what I love about it, it doesn't matter what standard of athlete you are, it's the same for everyone. The pace is on that scale of what is different, but the effort level, the intensity level that you're looking for is the same, because if it's down at 1, that's us just walking or sitting. If it's 2, 3, 4, it's easy running or recovery running. I would say 2 to 3 is recovery run, and then 4 maybe, we agreed at the weekend that in the group that anything below 5 would be classed as easy for the group. That's what they came to that conclusion, and everybody was happy to agree on that. And then after that, they said, yeah, it's more like steady, and then there's tempo, and then you're getting up into kind of anaerobic reps and VO2 max reps at the top end. And I said, yeah, and it depends how people want to, to quantify it. The first time you ever sat down in a talk with me at the Steve Cram training camp, I said, look, I use tempo and threshold as these terms, but I appreciate people use it in a different way. They have different terminologies for the same thing. But RPE, the scale of 1 to 10, there isn't much deviation from it, and that's what I like about it.
There's not much deviation. I'll pick up on another cultural anomaly, though. I spoke to a physio at the weekend about this idea of RPE and perception, and the physio said to me, she said, yeah, we use that all the time with injuries. We will often say to a patient that presents with, plantar fasciitis injury or shin splints, on a scale of 1 to 10, when I touch it, how painful is it? 10 being excruciating, 1 being mild. And that's quite common. People are very ready to do that. Oh, it's a 3, it's a 4. I deal with that with athletes. How painful is it? How's your shins feeling? How's your calf? And I do sense that athletes are very okay with that. They're very comfortable with that. But sometimes when you actually say, well, how did the run feel out of 10? They're less keen to do so. It's almost as if they can do it for an injury quite readily, but they're less reluctant to do it. I guess I'm thinking loud. They're less reluctant to do it for a run. And I just wonder whether it's because, I don't know, if your leg hurts, you can't really measure it unless you've got some MRI scan, but you're going to say, oh, it's a 3, it's a 4, it's a 5, I banged my head on a wall the other day out on a run and cut my head open. And I was, it's a 9 out of 10. We're ready to do that, but I sense that we're less ready as runners to do it when people say, how was your run out of 10? Because we just go, well, there's my data.
Yeah. I think tied into that as well, Matt, I agree. I think people rely on the data way too much to say, well, that's just how it was. Look at my splits. That's how it was. But actually, there can be a big difference between how something looks to split and how it actually felt. And sometimes I think we lack that honesty with ourselves. We want it to be easier than it is, and because it's not, we sometimes then don't want to put a number on it because we know we've maybe not achieved what we were going out to achieve. And I had this problem the other day with a session. I did a session on Tuesday with Gemma, that this was last Tuesday, the week before the race. I wanted it to feel easier. I didn't want to go too hard the week out from a race. It wasn't feeling as easy as I thought it was going to. That's a bit of perception of effort anyway, and a bit of psychology in there. I then felt a bit of a tweak in my calf, so I decided, you know what, I'm just going to stop this session. But if I was being brutally honest with myself, I would probably say that my mind was never really in it from the start, and I didn't really want to turn up and do a session that was like 7 out of 10. And I also wanted to make sure that I was ready to do 9, 10 out of 10 at the weekend.
Yes.
So sometimes I think we can kid ourselves, and if it's harder than we're perceiving it to be, we don't like that as humans, and we sometimes think of it as failure as well. Like, I've set somebody a session, I don't want you to go any more than an 8, and they're feeling like, oh God, this is a 9, and I don't want to disappoint you because I'm then not going to hit the splits that you want. But really, I'd be saying, look, I'm not bothered about the splits. I want you to pull back to an 8 to make sure that we're in the right zone, because that's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
We're not looking for the splits. We're looking to be in that right zone, and perception of effort gives us that.
Yeah. Again, just thinking a little bit broader, I know most people will accept the idea of a 1 to 10 scale. I've worked with athletes before that for somehow they've used a 1 to 15 scale, a 1 to 20 scale. I even worked with an athlete once that was, I guess, more of what you would call, in terms of a learning style, was more of a visual learner that would say that that's a green run. Green for her meant easy.
Yeah.
A red run is your kind of your VO2 max session. So she'd have this elaborate kind of colour code. I think there were 7 different colours where she'd say, no, that's a green, that's a yellow, that's an amber, that's an orange, and now it's a red. So and most people won't do that, but there's nothing, we're not trying to make a kind of fetish of this idea it has to be 1 to 10 or it even has to be numbers.
It's a bit like the ski runs you find in ski resorts. You have
right?
green, Like,
Is that I don't know. I've never been a skier, but
so yes, they have a green run, which is, I think even some resorts have a yellow, which is below that. But mainly the ones I've been to anyway, green runs, almost like your beginner runs. Then you have your blue runs, a little bit more advanced than that.
Right.
Then you have your red runs, which are
Really?
a bit more technical, a bit steeper. Then you have your black ones, which are really tough. And then you kind of have like off-piste stuff there, so they're not really graded. I think some resorts throw some different colours in that are just slightly harder than a black, like they classify them how they want. But you're right, it's like there's always like a colour code to certain things, and we see that with the zones. We use Final Surge as our software,
of course. Yeah.
And if people put their training zones into their Garmin, that'll sync through to Final Surge, and we can see them. I can think of certain athletes where that is the case for me, where they've got it programmed into the watch, and automatically that syncs up with their Final Surge, and it'll come up and say, right, today Lewis spent this amount of time in zone 2, and this colour for zone 2 was green. And then above that, but so sometimes those colour codes are classed towards the zones as well.
Yeah. So shall we try and spend a few minutes marrying the kind of RPE scale with the zonal system? Because I think with zones, most people listening will go, "Oh, I know what training zones are," but it is possible. I know when we were talking about this webinar, I said to you, "Well, you know, what zonal system do you use?" Because those zones are contested. There are different definitions. The zones that we use are social constructions. They're not social facts. So shall we spend a little bit of time marrying the RPE with the zonal system?
Absolutely. I think that's one thing people will really benefit from is like, well, this RPE scale is good, but what do you actually mean by, like, where does that relate in terms of these efforts I'm putting in?
Yeah.
So yeah, let's do it. What do you go for? Actually, how do you define it on the scale of 1 to 10? And then I'll explain if there's any differences with mine, the wording as such. But let's go through those zones. So your first zone is right down the bottom?
Right down the bottom for me would be the recovery zone, the first zone, and that would be a recovery run. And that would be the sort of run that we would typically affect post a race, post a hard training session, if a passive day of recovery wasn't needed. So, and I guess the other, if we flip it on its head, I would sometimes call that recovery run a shakeout run if it was before a big competition, if it was the day before a race.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be uncommon if it was a shakeout run to have a few 10-second alactic strides put in there. Perhaps you've arrived at a big hotel the day before the London Marathon. You want to do 2 or 3 miles dead steady and put a few strides in there to get your legs ticking over, make sure that you're not too tight after that long car journey. So I guess for me, my first zone would be recovery stroke shakeout, which is used around competition, either to recover or to really reduce the taper. Exactly
the same as me. And then I would say, for some athletes, a coach, that's a run. For some, it might be a walk, recovery walk. It's amazing how many people don't class that as a recovery method. And some, it might be cross-training as well for those people who want to offload a little bit as well. So it might be a recovery swim in there or a recovery cycle. But as long as it's low aerobic intensity where we are recovering from as I would say, a more intense or longer bit of exercise that has had quite a cost on the system. There's got to be some recovery in there.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And again, we can't emphasize this enough, that the amount of athletes that I speak to that don't record in their training diaries their final surges walking, which is a tragedy because, you should do it. I mean, the best example, I think we've alluded to this before, is the late, great Sir Roger Bannister, the first 4-minute mile in May 1954, I think it was. And people used to say to me when I was growing up, "Oh, Sir Roger Bannister ran a 4-minute mile. He ran teenage miles. He ran 15 miles a week." Well, that might have been true, but he also went walking 30 to 40 miles in the Peak District and areas like that every weekend, but he never recorded that. He never blew his own trumpet about it. But when people analysed his training, when I dug into it, I think I wrote a piece for Athletics Weekly about it. People wrongly assumed that he was doing all speed endurance work. It was all lactate stuff, and that you didn't need an aerobic base. And of course, he must have been laughing because he'd got his aerobic base not through steady running. he hadn't got the time to do that in the week when he was doing his medical degree in London, I think it was. He had half an hour to train and then eat his lunch. But he did the aerobic stuff at the weekend and people missed that. So I think that story of one of our most famous athletes is interesting. You know, Sir Roger Bannister wouldn't have run a 4-minute mile on 15 miles a week.
No.
He could do it because he'd got, you know, the 80% of what he was doing or thereabouts was aerobically dominant walking over the fells.
Yeah, and I had the pleasure of sitting with his son at the National Running Show on the Steve Cram training camp stand, and it was just fascinating listening to him, and even some of the things about like cycling as well.
Yeah.
You know, he was cycling to work, I believe, or even to the track, and there was that form of exercise in there that people weren't thinking about. But genuinely, he said, my dad operated off a bit of what people perceive to be a lower volume, but there was a lot of other things in there. So you've absolutely hit the nail on the head.
And that's when I will encourage my athletes to record it, because sometimes they don't value it enough. Oh, it was only a walk, it's not worth recording. To make sure that they see it as part of their training, sometimes I will say, hey, that does need to be in your final surge. That's good. Reward yourself. You know, add that 3-mile walk onto your 35-mile week. It's 38 miles. Oh, can I do that? Yeah, you've not cheated. No, that's fine. So sometimes there is a benefit to quantifying and capturing that.
Definitely. 100% agree. So next one then, for me, and then I'll come over to you. Easy is then my next zone. So we've got recovery. And I think this is really hard for people sometimes to define what's the difference. But there is a subtle difference for me in recovery runs or recovery activity, and then easy runs, easy activity. But easy runs fall again somewhere between that 3, 4, maybe touching 5, maybe, depending on the length of that easy run. But
so it shares for me a commonality. We're heavily into the aerobic energy system, you know. So it shares a commonality with the recovery run. I guess for me, the recovery run, you know, again, we're talking about biomechanics. It might feel more like a shuffle, a jog. You know, like the shakeout run will be literally just, you know, take it easy and shuffle along and then put a few strides in. I guess the easy run, the easy run for me is where you are running biomechanically rather than simply jogging. That would be my difference.
Yeah, and I think people find it hard to do that pace, the recovery run. They say, oh, biomechanically it feels awkward, and I was honest with somebody recently at a workshop. They said, I just can't lock into that pace, and I don't think it's that you can't look into it. I think it's just that you've not done enough of it and you're not used to it, and you really need to practice it. It's a skill to practice.
A skill to learn to jog.
Absolutely.
Even.
Skill acquisition. That's what it is.
It is, isn't it? And I think we're all, again, we're all a product of our time. Had you and I been sat here in the 1970s, you know, that's when in America and again in this country, there was the jogging boom.
Yeah.
And even in British coaches like Frank Dick, who led the British team, coached people like Daley Thompson in the 80s, would do not podcasts, but videos and kind of TV programs about how to jog. And it was jogging, you know. And so we were a nation back then that grew into learning how to jog rather than run in the 70s. You know, but we've lost that skill.
I think we've lost it, and I think there's a lot out there that promotes people to run faster. Strava being one, parkrun, people always competing with each other and themselves and other people and sharing data. Whereas before, like you say, the culture was very different and it encouraged more jogging. So up from easy then, have you got a zone up from there, Matt?
Yeah, for me, I'd talk about steady running, and again, this is a real grey area. But I guess for me, that's sub kind of threshold running. You're not at your threshold pace. It's a steady run. I will often say, you know, to an athlete, do a long, steady run, do a steady 15-mile run. No tempo blocks within there. You are building for the London Marathon. So for me, a steady run will have a purpose. Ordinarily, the social practice of it means that it's higher in volume than a recovery run or an easy run. Typically, for me, that will be a long Sunday run, which isn't at half marathon or marathon specific pace.
So let's dial into that, because I'm exactly the same. Steady's next on my scale. And I'll set a long Sunday run, and my description on my long Sunday run to a lot of my runners is, let's just say they're going to go out for 2 hours, for example. It's a 2-hour run. I would like intensity to be at RPE 3 or 4 out of 10. I'd like you to be at easy intensity. However, by the end, that may feel more like steady effort.
Yeah.
So by the time you get to the end of that run, you're going to be more like 6 or 7 because it's a sliding scale, this. Even though the pace has remained the same, we've actually gone up on that scale a little bit. And I
because
think,
of the volume.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's where people get confused, isn't it? They're like, well, you said steady, so I went out at 6 and then I couldn't hold that pace.
And that's a really big learning. One of the bugbears that I have is I'm somebody that's also a Lydiard trained coach as well. And I think Arthur Lydiard was very, very good at teaching us that sometimes the long run has to be protected as a session in itself. Just spoke to an athlete this morning that was basically saying, well, I'm going to smash apart run at the weekend on Saturday and I'm going to do a 20-mile long run on Sunday. And she couldn't get it into her head that actually you shouldn't be doing that because you know, in between a park run or a hard 5K, if you're using it as a time trial, you need either a recovery run or an easy run. You don't just go on to a steady long run. But I guess for her, she was like, I guess she couldn't make the distinction between having an easy run, which might be 4 or 5 miles just to get the legs turning over, and doing more volume. To her, because it was low intensity, she thought, well, why can't I do that? And I think for me, a lot of athletes conflate an easy run, a steady run, a long steady run with an easy or a recovery run. There's that conflation. Oh, it's Lewis has said it's 3 or 4 out of 10. Oh, anybody can run that. Doesn't matter that it's 15 miles, but it's the volume that is the killer.
Yeah, I agree completely, Matt. And on that point of the 5K and the 20 miler, we touched on this at the marathon workshop at the weekend. I like to look at that 20 miler as like, well, it might seem like an easy intensity for you, but what is the cost of that 20 miler to you as a person? Like
in terms of the mechanical loading.
Exactly that. Yeah. And everything, like you look at it and you go, right, well, it might look like the volume is just an easy intensity volume, but actually what's the loading effect of that? And what's the cost to you? And that's where there was a high cost on the Saturday because the volume was low, but the intensity's high. And then it's the opposite on the Sunday. The intensity's low, but the volume's high. Yeah. So they've both had equivalent of high cost in a different way, and you've put them back to back. Some people ever so often do that as a training effect. They try and overreach, and we see that common in triathlon where they have these big training weekends. But for me, if you're not trained well enough to do that and you're not monitoring things well enough, that is a high-risk strategy that often has bad consequences.
Yeah, let's be honest with you. I mean, I also coach a couple of ultra runners that will deliberately they will backload their week. Their work has to be done. The volume has to be done at weekends. They'll do a long run on the Saturday of 26 mile, for example, and then do a 13-mile run the next day. That's a deliberate strategy, and that's thought through proactively. But we're not talking about this. What we're talking about are people that can't disaggregate, a steady run from an easy run from a recovery run. And in my day as a club athlete, people used to say, oh, your long Sunday run, it's time on your feet. Well, you don't say that when you're doing a recovery run, do you? Or an easy run. You don't say, I'm just off for a bit of time on my feet. Whereas we do for that kind of steady run, which is why it needs to be disaggregated.
Yes, and let's stick in steady then, because a lot of marathon runners are coming into marathon season, and the common question I got at the National Running Show was, well, is steady marathon pace? And I said, well, depends who you are. And they kind of looked confused at me. And I define steady like physiologically from my learning and understanding from the physiologist I've worked with, that it's usually around 3 hours that you can sustain a steady pace for. So 3 hours worth of work. Yeah. So what I was saying to this individual was, well, if you're a 3-hour marathon runner, give or take, in and around there, that is going to be steady pace for you. Yes. But I said, let's get an understanding here of physiology and how this is going to be different for different standards of runners. Yeah. So at the weekend, we said to people, okay, well, where's Eliud Kipchoge or, somebody like a Bridget Kosgei or Paula Radcliffe on that scale? So if 3 hours is steady, that means that they need to be slightly higher than steady for their marathon pace because they're doing the marathon in 2 hours to 2:15, for example. And everyone agreed, yes, okay, so their marathon pace is slightly above steady. Okay, but then we've got somebody who wants to run 5 hours. So they're going to run 5 hours. So where does their marathon pace sit?
Yes.
Because you can only hold steady for 3 hours. And they said, oh, well, actually, their marathon pace is easy. And I said, yeah, absolutely right. Because physiologically speaking, they're doing an ultra here because they're out for 5 hours. So then we went all the way back to the elites, you know, Paula Radcliffe, Shelley Kipchoge's the best marathon runners the world's ever seen. And I said, now let's apply that same physiology to Paula and Elliot. So we're going to say to them, right, you're going to do a 5-hour run. Where do you need to be on that RPE chart? And they all agreed they need to be below steady because they're going to try and hold it for 5 hours.
Yes.
And I said, there you go. Like this is why we're not all set on everybody's steady state is marathon pace. Yeah. It's impossible. And this is where you've got to use this skill for your own benefit and your own advantage, but you've got to suss it out yourself as well, haven't you?
So as coaches, we need to be athlete-centered in the way in which we apply that. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay, let's go from 6, let's go to more 7, 8. Where do you sit there, Matt?
Well, again, this is a big strength of yours and something I learned a lot from you. The next stage for me would be the threshold type of runs. You know, you've often used the word tempo. I prefer the word threshold. I think it's more specific. For me, tempo means, you know, you can run a 3K tempo, a 5K tempo. It means all things to all people. But for me, you're getting into that upper end of your aerobic capacity. Threshold running. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I've now gone down the route, particularly for a lot of the athletes I work with at the top end, of defining that into 2 categories because I think they get confused because a lot of people say tempo is a pace that you should be able to hold for an hour, or threshold is a pace you should be able to hold for an hour. Now, we know a lot of physiological testing now says we've got this first lactic turn point, and then we've got the second lactic turn point, that lactic threshold. And there's a big window in the middle of there.
Yes,
you know, and being at the top end of that is a lot different to being at the bottom end of that. So those 2 turn points is what I'm saying. So we've got turn point 1 and turn point 2, just for those of you listening and tuning in. And then we've got a gap in between those turns, like a space. And there's a big difference between the top end of that turn point towards lactic turn point 2 and being right close to lactic turn point 1. Yeah. So what I've done with my athletes is I've said, right, on my scale, I'm going to say tempo is around 7 and threshold is around 8.
Yeah.
Do you all understand that? Yeah, I get that. Okay. And if tempo is something we could sustain for an hour, for you elite athletes, that's in and around between 10 miles and half marathon pace, somewhere around there. So that gives you a good gauge, guys. But actually, we're going to say threshold. We want to push that threshold a little bit. We're going to say that's a bit closer to kind of 10K. So that's between your 10 mile and 10K because we want to
8 out of 10.
8 out of 10, exactly that. And that's, I've started to use that concept now, and that seems to resonate really well for people because I think they find that just tempo seems to be almost too big of a zone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good disaggregation, So a 7 or an 8.
Exactly
definitely,
that. Yeah.
Good.
So then we go above that. So we've gone, right, threshold, and we can break. I think really important to say here, in order to develop that threshold, and I'm sure you would agree, I often break that down into reps and give them threshold reps because I think it's really hard to maintain.
What we would call in the discourse in and out tempo work.
Yes. Yeah.
And I often feel as a coach, one of the training stimuluses that athletes will get from that is where we have the interplay between a continuous block of tempo one week and then a discontinuous block of in and out tempo the next.
Yes, and I think it's really important for marathon runners in particular, those people who are doing longer events like ultras and even half marathons. You've got to have some form of continuous tempo running in there, or steady running in there, to get used to it psychologically as much as anything. Back to our point right at the start that you were saying to me, like, what are you thinking about when you're running? It's a good chance to practice all that in those continuous tempo runs.
Yeah.
So we go up to 8, we've got 8 threshold, and then 9. Where are you sitting at 9?
Well, for me, I think that's where interval training begins. And remember that there's a difference between the notion of the interval and a repetition. An interval is where, Peter Thompson, a very famous coach educator based in Oregon now, would say the interval training is where the focus is on the mode of recovery. So for me, it would be aerobic intervals. And there's 3 golden rules for me for an aerobic interval, Lewis. One, it's a long effort. It's relatively long in terms of minutes or in terms of volume. Short recovery. Yeah. But critically, what people tend to miss off when they're feeding back to a coach is that it should be still some active mode of recovery. So it shouldn't be a walk. It should either be a jog or a mode of floating. And that's the thing that people tend to miss. But aerobically dominant, ordinarily beyond threshold pace, we might be looking at, I don't know, people running at 10k pace, perhaps dipping into 5k pace. 5 by a K would be a classic example. 5 by a K with, a minute recovery, but, make sure the minute is, an active recovery, 5 by 2K, 3 by 2K. Those sorts of sessions for me, which would probably be beyond threshold, a little bit different from an in and out tempo, a little bit more challenging in terms of intensity, but certainly not what we would classify. I think athletes sometimes say, well, that's speed work then. It's not. It's aerobic endurance still. It's an aerobic interval. It's not a speed endurance session.
Yeah, and I think this is where we have to be very careful with our descriptions as coaches, because I think a lot can fall into this 9 and particularly 10 category. So, 9 for me, exactly the same as you. There's going to be some aerobic intervals where the athletes are going to get to 9 out of 10, but they've probably started down at 8 out of 10 in that session. But again, the duration of the session has challenged them to get to 9 out of 10. But then your VO2 max type work, as you quite rightly say, Matt, where, the recovery really dictates the intensity of the repetition. So something like, I'll go with the 5 by a K that you mentioned, and instead of having a 1 minute and making that a more of aerobic session, we have 2.5 to 3 minutes. In fact, I'll say 3 minutes. It's almost 1-to-1 recovery for our elite athletes. That becomes even harder then. That's like a real high-end 9 almost, isn't it? And we're tipping into that VO2 max category.
Yeah, and I'll never forget, I think I'm going back 10 years or more now. I remember coaching at Birmingham University with the great Bud Baldaro, and we were at some kind of coach education session, and we were discussing Hannah England's type of work, and she'd just won a silver, as you'll remember, at the World Championships in the 1500. And I remember somebody in the audience saying, Hannah England, I'm making the session, Hannah England does the same in the summer as she does in the winter. She does 10 400s in the summer and 10 400s in the winter. And I said, forgive me, a little bit creative license here with the times, but I said, well, no, she's doing 10 400s in the winter in 70 seconds off a lap float recovery. She's doing 10 400s in the summer at close to 64 seconds, but she's got a 3-minute passive walk recovery. Yeah, it's a materially different session. So often what you find is athletes look at the session, but by completely ignoring the length and the mode of recovery. That's the last thing, it really frustrates me as a coach. The last thing an athlete will ever say to me when they feed back is that they will say that the rep or the interval, that they will say the recovery time, but very rarely will they articulate or want to articulate the mode of recovery.
It's because I was coached by John Nuttall, and the late great John Nuttall, and he emphasised the importance of recovery to me quite early. And, I'm not judging you on your reps, I'm judging you on your recovery, he used to say to me, which I thought was genius. I'm looking at how you recover, tells me everything I need to know. But because of that, I used to look at my session, and I'm not going to say it was the first thing I looked at, but one of the first things I did look at was what recovery you're giving me. Yeah. Because that's going to tell me the intensity that John wants for those repetitions. The repetitions aren't going to tell me the intensity. They're going to give me an idea, but as you quite rightly say, Matt, 10 4s off 3 minutes is a lot different to 10 4s even off a minute.
Of course it is.
Completely different session. And what we're looking for here, and I think this is a good coaching lesson for anybody listening, even if you coach yourself, is what I try and do with my sessions now, and it's been a really good learning for me over the years working with yourself and different other coaches who we kind of mentor each other, always chatting to each other, is looking at, what do I want to elicit from this session? What is the physiological properties I want to elicit from this session? Is there anything psychological I want to get from it? And then I look at the structure of the session and I say, right, is that recovery going to allow me to get that out of that session? And that's how we piece together these sessions.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
So if someone's looking at that and saying, well, those sessions are the same just because they've got the same number of repetitions, it's the same volume, then you're totally on the wrong page. Yeah.
Absolutely. And isn't it interesting how we've been through, let's just recap, let's just revise. So I think we've got 6 zones, haven't we? We've talked about recovery. Easy, steady.
Yeah.
Threshold.
Yeah. Tempo, just ahead of that.
Yeah. And then, going above that.
Yes.
You're talking about your aerobic intervals, and then the final one, your speed endurance or your VO2 max kind of stuff.
And this is
most of them are aerobic. That's the key learning point.
Absolutely. They're all almost all aerobic to that point. And this is where the top end of that scale is so interesting for me, because we know a VO2 max session is going to be kind of hard. It's going to be 10 out of 10. But I'll say to the athletes, like, if you go 10 out of 10 on rep 1, we're probably going to be in trouble. We've got to probably start at 9 and get to 10.
Yes.
Whereas, like, if I'm prescribing, and rightly so, if I'm prescribing fast strides, which are speed work, 6 to 10 second lactic strides, I'm saying to them, look, I do want them to be 10 out of 10 in terms of the effort you're putting in. I call it optimum. So we're looking to put optimum effort in whilst trying to focus on relaxation and being good with our running form. But the effort of that isn't going to feel like 10 because it's too short for you guys to get that feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people get confused with this. Like, it's almost, we're asking for 10 out of 10 in terms of intensity, but actually sometimes it's not going to feel like 10 out of 10.
Absolutely. And I guess this is probably, we're hinting or looking ahead to a future podcast, but just to give you another visual analogy, I don't know whether I've used it on a podcast before, but I've been taught the egg basket analogy. I don't know whether you've heard of it.
Yeah, you've mentioned that before to me, yeah.
You've got 3 egg baskets. You've got a fast basket, you've got a slow basket, you've got a medium in the middle basket. And I guess this is longer term around how we periodize our work. We've got to think about, well, using that scale of RPE, using the zonal system, am I the sort of athlete that benefits most or best from what we call polarized training? Now, polarized training means you put some eggs in basket 1, fast basket, not too many, and some eggs in basket 3, the slow basket. You polarize,
Yeah.
Or alternatively, am I the sort of athlete that benefits not from polarization, but from what the physiologists, people like you, Dave Sheldon, that works for us, will talk about, non-polarized training, where you put not all, but the majority of your eggs into the middle medium basket.
Pyramidal, I think they're referring to that now.
Yeah.
Pyramidal.
Yeah. And again, there's not one size fits all. And even so, I'm asking athletes to think about what might work for them. But at different points of the periodization cycle, I work with an athlete that at the minute will put most of her eggs in basket 2.
Yeah.
When it comes to the spring and she moves from the country, the trails, the mountains onto the track, she will polarize from spring onwards and then go. So she will begin to divide those basket 2 eggs into 1s and 3s. You can't, the moral of the story is with the egg basket analogy, you can't just put eggs in all the baskets. You're either a 1 or a 3 or a 2. You can't be a 1, 2, and 3 because that's where you'll get problems.
Yeah, and I think that's what people try to do and they get confused. So let's go with a middle approach here, because I'm a big fan of what we call intensity distribution, of like making sure you're hitting all those zones. But that doesn't mean you're putting all your eggs in the baskets. What it means is if you're in that pyramidal, a lot of that work is dominantly done in and around steady or threshold. But there's still a little bit of easy stuff in there. And there's still a little bit of faster stuff. But predominantly speaking, it's all in that middle basket is what we're saying, aren't we, Matt?
That's right.
And I think that's the confusion. People then go, right, well, everything I do has got to be zone 2 or zone 3 because I'm going to go all in on that. And actually say, no, we still want some variance in there. But depending on the period of training you're in, as you quite rightly say, it depends on what that looks like. So I'm going to use Gemma again, as who I coach, my wife, as an example. Right now, we're really trying to develop Gemma's threshold running. But we're also trying to develop her downhill skill of running. So the downhill running as a skill even. Now, a big learning for me has been, in order to develop a skill that has that technicity, she's got to be in quite a fresh state. If I get her to develop that when she's tired, it becomes quite high risk and we probably won't get the benefit. So when she's on her easy runs, we're adding in some downhill work, and that is now starting to become a little bit faster within the easy run. So the easy runs are maybe a little bit harder than what they would be usually. And we're also working hard at developing that threshold and tempo. So there's loads in the middle right now. There's actually not much at all in the speed work. But she still does her strides once a week. So we still tap into it. But you're absolutely bang on. In the period we're in now, we're going to sit in there, and we're going to sit there for quite a while. And this is what got me at the National Running Show, and people were saying, yeah, but everyone's saying about this 80-20 rule. And I said, well, where are you in terms of your training? Because that can't be applicable all the way through your training plan, can it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the interesting thing, Lewis, is it's sadly that in the culture that we inhabit, I mean, I know one of the national magazines went through a period a few years ago of talking about star athletes and their killer sessions. Yeah. And I think athletes do tend to get preoccupied with what's the session or what's the best session to do. Whereas what you and I have tried to do today is there's a saying we have in Burton-on-Trent. I don't know whether you've ever heard of it, but my late mother, God rest her soul, used to say, be careful, son, you can't see the wood for the trees. Have you ever heard of that saying? It's where you get so bogged down into the detail of 10 400s this, 8 300s that actually you need to step back and see the bigger picture. Why are we doing this work? And that will only come from the RPE scale. It will only come from educating yourself around the zonal system. It will only, and if that doesn't work for you, go to something more visual. Think about the egg baskets.
To tie that in, your visual there, it's a really good one. It's my learning for the week from you. Is the problem Gemma had with downhill running. If any trail or ultra runners listening here, she couldn't see the wood from the trees because she was so focused on what is in front of her and where her foot is going. She actually wasn't visualizing her path down at all. She wasn't looking at picking a route and being visually aware of all those other things around her that you've got to do when you're descending at speed. So many people become so obsessed and zoned in. And I'm kind of, if you're not watching on video, I'm doing that with my eyes, my hands, zoning in on something that you're almost too focused on it. And you then, for her, she's not relaxed, she's not flowing down the hill. So it's a really good analogy that you use.
The psychologists and social psychologists talk about it as being myopic or myopia, that kind of short-term vision, the idea that, if you're looking at somebody cycling, I was looking out the window today and it's just, East Midlands Airport in the background and somebody cycling seems to be going faster than the plane. It's all about your perception, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And myopia. So I'd certainly encourage athletes to try and develop, to go beyond that short-termism, to get themselves a new pair of spectacles where they can put this into perspective and think about training macrocycles and mesocycles rather than just the minutiae of what's the best session to do, for a marathon, what's the best 10K session.
And I think we could sit here all day and we could say, well, how much easy running should people be doing, and how many, like you say, what are these key sessions that people should be putting in marathon plans, and what should you be doing in your off season, blah blah blah, and go into so much detail. And to be honest, we'll never satisfy everyone because it's a very individual sport, as you put and quite rightly said earlier. It's a very athlete-centered sport, and we have that coaching relationship with our athletes where we're able to do that. But what we hope this has provided you at home with is just some knowledge and tools to go away and have a think about your training and where you are on that, particularly in that period of time. Where are you on that training plan? And are you periodizing your training a little bit? Are you differentiating between the different phases? And how you could potentially do that very simply by using that RPE scale and being aware of the zones that you're training. But what we can't do is give you an exact formula, because there never is an exact formula. It's very different for different people. And you've kind of got to figure that out in the same way we do as coaches for the athletes we work with.
Absolutely. So three bits of homework, really. One, are you using an RPE scale, and which one? And if not, why aren't you using one? Secondly, go and educate yourself about the zonal system. With your consent, I might be able to do a little blog associated with that on zonal systems. And thirdly, think about analogies that work for you. Think about the egg basket analogy, which brings polarized versus pyramidal training alive. So go away and do the thinking, really.
And hopefully you can, like you say, find plenty of education out there, but this has been an insight. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I always learn. I feel like we learn every time we talk to each other, and it's really beneficial for us as coaches. So hopefully it's been beneficial for you at home. I'm going to leave you with those 3 takeaways, that bit of homework from Matt. We will follow it up with a blog. Matt's been doing some fantastic work for us, writing up about our podcast. So if you've not found that already, head on over to New Levels Coaching and have a look at our blog. And if you like what Matt's writing and you maybe want to speak to him more about coaching, then get in touch with us at New Levels Coaching, because Matt, as a lot of our coaches do, have capacity to take people on. And we know it's that time of year where people are looking and thinking, I've got big goals for 2024. I might need some support with that. Well, if you want some support with that, you can book in for a call with myself or Jethro, and we'll chat to see if we are the right people to help you on that running journey, and if we can support you, and if we've got the coaches and if they've got the capacity to help you on that journey as well. It might be that you're not thinking about coaching and you just want to keep tuning into these podcasts, but also with the blogs as well now on there. There's lots of information, education for you to go away and read and educate yourself, and that might be step 1 for you, and that's great as long as you're getting that education to help you inform your training. So my last message, as always, is enjoy your training. Best of luck for anybody racing out there. There's lots of races coming up for our coaches. Matt, are you racing soon?
Well, I just want to shake your hand and say, if you invite me, because you're on camera, if you invite me to this trail workshop,
you will be invited. Yes,
I promise that before I come, I will learn how to use a compass. Is that a deal?
That is a deal. That is a deal. We can't have you as a run leader, can we, if you don't know where you're going? But it is in your neck of the woods. It's Derbyshire, so you might be at a bit of an advantage.
Fantastic.
Yeah. But a couple of races coming up for our coaches, and there's been some fantastic performances, as always, with our athletes as well. So big shout out to all our New Levels Coaching athletes who continue to fly the flag very, very high. Enjoy your training, and we will see you all very soon. Thanks, everybody.